King Henry lay gravely ill. It had been 15 years since his son and heir William had drowned in the Channel, a victim of the White Ship disaster. Henry had been distraught. In the years since, he had remarried in the hope of siring another heir, but God had not granted him another son. As he lay dying, he must have pondered the predicament which lay ahead after he was gone. He had attempted to mitigate the precarious situation by swearing his barons to an oath that upon his death they would favour his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as heir to the throne. However, he must have foreseen that this would be unlikely. It was difficult for women to rule during this period. While not without precedent, it was highly unlikely to work. As King Henry took his last breaths, he may have wondered on his reign. 35 years of rule. Had he been a good king? What kind of kingdom was he leaving behind? And most of all, who would rule it? The answer to who would rule was King Stephen, and this tumultuous episode in medieval history takes place during his reign. It was a 19-year period that began with the death of Henry I in 1135 and ended with Stephen's death in 1154. A reign of almost 20 years may make it seem like Stephen reigned over a peaceful kingdom, but medieval rulership was never so straightforward. His position was much debated, and he faced strong opposition for the majority of those 19 years from his cousin and daughter of the late Henry, the Empress Matilda. Backed by her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester, she fought both politically and militarily for the throne of England, aiming to become the first female monarch to rule the land. She would ultimately fail at this, but her legacy endured through her son, Henry. Much of the country remained in the hands of the noble barons, who chose not to support either side during the early years of the war. Stephen held the southeast, and Matilda held much of the southwest and Thames Valley. The pivotal moment of the war came with the Battle of Lincoln in February 1141. Though many of Stephen's men fled the field to avoid capture, Stephen himself could not contemplate fleeing. Orderic Vitalis notes that he was mindful of the brave deeds of his ancestors, a consideration surely compounded by his father's reputation for cowardice. Chroniclers like Henry of Huntingdon wrote of the dramatic clash of metal swords and depicted Stephen alone in the centre of the battlefield. Though we must consider bias, chroniclers all wrote of how bravely and ferociously King Stephen fought. Eventually, surrounded and having lost both his weapons, the king was forced to submit and became a prisoner of Earl Robert. Stephen was taken to Gloucester and presented to his cousin, the Empress. She kept him in close custody, and soon he was sent on to Bristol. After 6 years of fighting, Matilda was finally to become queen. However, instead of rushing to Winchester to secure the crown's treasury, she delayed her journey east. By early March, she had still not come to an agreement with King Stephen's brother, Bishop Henry of Winchester, to enter the city. They came to an agreement that if Henry could persuade church officials to allow her coronation, when made queen, Matilda would grant Henry control over church affairs in England. Henry called a council in Winchester at Easter, seeking an agreement from church officials for the coronation of Matilda. However, many of the leading nobles and churchmen of the land remained loyal to Stephen. Bishop Henry excommunicated those who refused to change allegiance. A delegation of officials visited the incarcerated Stephen in Bristol, who agreed to release them from their fealty, and in a council held in early April, they agreed that Matilda would be crowned queen. Matilda, now to be known as Lady of the English, headed to London to begin arrangements for her coronation as queen in June. Meanwhile, another Matilda enters the story. Queen Matilda of Boulogne, wife of King Stephen. She wrote to England demanding the immediate release of her husband. When Empress Matilda entered the city of London, she found little support. Only Geoffrey, Earl of Essex, stood by her side. The Earl was a powerful man, having control over the Tower of London, but Matilda needed far more support. It is reported that the people of London did little to welcome Matilda, even going so far as to be hostile towards her becoming queen. In part due to her being a woman, but mainly because having been raised in the Germanic way of ruling, she thought a monarch should have absolute power over laws. In England, however, the nobles had more of a say in these matters. She refused to make concessions, and because of this, the city's allegiance shifted back to Stephen. Before the scheduled coronation could take place on the 24th of June, the people rose up against her and drove her and her supporters out of the city. Matilda had to flee to Oxford in a chaotic and desperate escape. Over the summer months, Stephen remained imprisoned. This led his wife Matilda to cross the Channel from France to England, and she quickly took control of London. Bishop Henry, ever the pragmatist, then changed sides once more. Now, in support of his sister-in-law, Matilda of Boulogne, he took a force to Winchester, which was garrisoned by Angevin forces. Hearing of this, Empress Matilda gathered her men, and on the 31st of July, she entered the city. This took Bishop Henry by surprise, and unprepared for such an encounter, he fled. However, he rallied, and on the 2nd of August, his troops set fire to Winchester, devastating large areas of the city. Empress Matilda, who had set up quarters in the royal castle, and Robert of Gloucester, stationed in St. Swithin's Church, were unharmed. In retaliation, the Empress and her army began to set siege outside the walls of Bishop Henry's palace at Wolvesey. But Queen Matilda, William of Ypres, and a large contingent of Londoners quickly pounced. The Empress and her army were trapped between the garrison inside the castle and Queen Matilda's army behind. This was a carefully executed trap. The two forces clashed for many days until on the 14th of September, Earl Robert, in a move that signalled he believed the battle lost, created a diversion, while Empress Matilda made her escape to Oxford. Left alone but for a few of his men, a retreating Earl Robert was captured and kept prisoner by William of Ypres. Both he and King Stephen had ultimately faced the same fate. Soon enough, Stephen's supporters were proposing a prisoner exchange. At first, Earl Robert refused this. He believed the Empress should seek more, as she had a king as a prisoner and he was an earl, and therefore it was not a fair swap. Empress Matilda was desperate for her half-brother back, and therefore, on the 1st of November 1141, King Stephen was released from Bristol Castle. Leaving behind his wife and son as a guarantee, when he reached Winchester, Robert Earl of Gloucester was immediately released. Robert then travelled to Bristol, and when he arrived there, King Stephen's wife and son were released. The country was now back in the same position it had been before the Battle of Lincoln, some 7 months prior. But what the past 7 months had shown was that Empress Matilda had failed. She had come within touching distance of wearing the crown, but her personality had scuppered her. It was around this time that the 9-year-old son of the Empress, Henry of Anjou, arrived in England. Sent by his father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, it was hoped his presence would show the barons of England that even if Empress Matilda failed in her bid for the crown, the Angevin fight was not over. Henry would no doubt be seen as a more suitable ruler than his mother, being the grandson of Henry I and the great-grandson of the Conqueror. King Stephen, now freed, knew his only chance of winning the war was to capture the Empress herself. Her position at Oxford would present a good opportunity to do this. He gathered his troops and made first for Wareham, attacking one of the only ports the Angevins were in control of. After taking other strategic towns on his way back up the Thames Valley, the only major base left under Angevin control was Wallingford Castle in Oxfordshire, near to where Empress Matilda was stationed. In late September 1142, Stephen and his force of approximately 1,000 men laid siege to Oxford, trapping Empress Matilda within its walls. Earl Robert attempted to rouse as many knights as he could in an attempt to free her, but could only muster not much more than 300, and set off from Cirencester towards Oxford. However, he did not get far. It was late November, and the harsh winter conditions of snow and ice made travel almost impossible. King Stephen remained outside the city walls, protected by the defensive earthworks. His troops battered the castle relentlessly with siege engines. The garrison had been inside for months, and the freezing winter conditions gave them little hope. It was at this point that Empress Matilda made a decision that would place her firmly into the history books. During the dead of night, Empress Matilda and 3 of her most trusted knights made for a daring escape. Dressed in white cloaks to act as a camouflage against the snow-covered background, they exited Oxford Castle through the postern gate. But how would they cross the river? Luckily, the Thames had frozen over, meaning they could carefully cross. They had made it to the encampments of King Stephen's army, somehow, and the chroniclers put this down to God's will. They managed to find a way through unnoticed, and continue on 6 miles in frozen conditions to reach the safety of Wallingford Castle. Once again, Matilda had evaded Stephen's grasp. After Matilda's flight, the fighting continued for another 11 years. In 1148, Empress Matilda returned to Normandy, which had been taken in her name by her husband Geoffrey in 1143. She had left the fight for England to her eldest son Henry. Her return to Normandy signalled the end of her fight for the crown, but in the same instant perhaps gave more hope to the Angevin cause. In 1152, Stephen attempted to have his son Eustace officially recognised as his heir, but the church rejected this proposal. By this point, the country had become war-weary and wished for a solution to the war that had engulfed them for almost 2 decades. Henry of Anjou invaded England a year later, but there was limited fighting. The 2 forces met at Wallingford Castle, but before any real conflict could begin, the church brokered a truce between the 2 sides. This gave Stephen and Henry the opportunity to begin peace negotiations, during which Stephen's son Eustace died. What followed was the Treaty of Wallingford, which stated that Stephen would retain the throne and that Henry would be his successor. This was seemingly a good deal for both parties. King Stephen died the following year, and Henry of Anjou became Henry II, the first Angevin king of England. Of this period, one chronicler stated that Christ and his saints were asleep. Indeed, this was a chaotic time, but perhaps the idea of 2 decades of anarchy are somewhat misleading. Certain regions faced periods of chaos, but mainly it was a period of instability brought on by the inability of Henry I to sire a male heir after the tragic death of his son in the White Ship disaster. But it is a fascinating episode in British history, and one that warrants more widespread interest.